Imagine like a huge heist, but it's not gold or jewels. It's something central to who a whole group of people are. And it wasn't grabbed overnight. It sort of vanished over centuries.
That's exactly the provocative idea we're digging into today. We're looking at how the actual personal name of God, Yahweh, faded from, the everyday life and worship of the ancient Israelites.
Starting around the 6th century BC, right?
That's the period the source points to, yeah.
And the source material we have, it presents this as, well, it calls it the Yahweh Heist. It argues this was pretty deliberate.
A conscious effort, it suggests, to make God's own name something his people basically felt they couldn't or shouldn't say.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack that. How did this happen? Why did the personal name of God become, well, almost taboo?
Exactly. We want to understand the mechanics, the factors involved in this shift.
And, I mean, the core argument from the source is, it's pretty bold. It doesn't just see this as, like, things changing naturally.
No, it points the finger, so to speak. It suggests it was a calculated campaign by the devil using different tactics.
Which sounds dramatic, I know.
It does. It really does.
Yeah.
But we're going to look at the evidence and the line of reasoning the source lays out.
Okay. And it identifies these three terrible forces as the enemies: Satan, sin, and society. That's the framework for understanding this whole heist idea.
That's the structure it provides, yes. So maybe let's start with the first signs of this loss, this departure.
Where does the source point first?
Well, it brings up 1 Samuel chapter 4, the naming of Ichabod.
Ichabod. The glory has departed from Israel.
Exactly. That moment, after the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant, is presented as maybe an early symptom. A feeling of loss that foreshadows the name itself fading later.
Right. Like a loss of connection symbolized by the ark and then later the name itself.
And the source really emphasizes how central that name Yahweh had been for such a long time. We're talking like 3,500 years before this decline really kicks in around the 6th century BC.
3.5 millennia. That's huge for a name to be that fundamental.
It makes the shift all the more striking, doesn't it? Going from something so central, so woven into their identity,
to being forbidden. By the religious leaders, no less. The very people you'd think would champion it.
Precisely. It really makes you pause and think,
The source definitely doesn't mince words. It calls it a major heist of epic proportions.
And even uses that phrase, Ocean 6666. A bit of dark humor, maybe, but it shows how seriously it frames this shift.
Yeah, as a deliberate theft with massive implications.
So, to get how the source thinks this heist happened, we need to look at those three enemies it mentioned.
Okay, let's break them down. First up, Satan.
Right. According to the source, Satan is, well, the archenemy, the liar, the murderer, going right back to Genesis 3, the serpent in the garden.
The original deception.
Yeah. And it pulls in verses from 1 John, 1 Peter, describing his aim to corrupt God's creation, especially humans.
But not acting alone, you said?
That's key. The second force is sin. The source traces this back to Adam, referencing Romans 5.1 there.
Ushering in a fallen world, basically.
A world where human nature itself is inclined towards self-destruction, even opposing God. That's the source's view.
But it also stresses human responsibility, right, even with that influence.
Absolutely. It cites John 8.44, people are still responsible for their choices. Sin influences, but doesn't remove agency entirely.
Okay. And the third element, society.
Society, or the world. The source calls it Satan's regime, a kind of system built on sin and death.
That humans have become complicit in.
Exactly. Through our choices, it mentions 1 John 2, James 4, Ephesians 2. The idea is this sinister synergy between Satan's influence and human sinfulness shaping the culture, the world system.
Okay, so you have these three forces: Satan, sin, society. How does the source say they work together to pull off this heist of the name?
It talks about a precipitous decline starting in that 6th century BC period.
And happened in stages.
Yeah, a gradual tightening of restrictions. It wasn't like a switch was flipped.
Right.
First, the name was used openly.
Right.
Then, its use became more limited, maybe just to religious leaders.
Okay.
Then, even tighter. Only the high priest could say it.
Wow.
And even then, only in a very specific place, the Holy of Holies in the temple, and only at specific times, like the Day of Atonement.
It's like locking it away deeper and deeper.
That's a good way to put it. Until finally, by around the 3rd century BC, speaking, the name pretty much stopped altogether.
And it even became outlawed.
The source references the Jewish Virtual Library here, noting some later rabbinic views that pronouncing YHVH literally could cost you your place in the world to come, or even warrant death.
That's That's intense.
And by the 1st century AD, the actual pronunciation was apparently forgotten by most.
From being treasured to being punishable by death and damnation, it's an incredible turnaround.
A huge shift.
Yeah.
So the source digs into why. It identifies 3 main factors driving this.
Okay, what's the first one?
The first is what it calls a misguided practice of fencing God's commands.
Fencing. What does that mean exactly?
Imagine God gives a command. Fencing is adding extra rules around it, building a fence, supposedly to stop people from even getting close to breaking the main rule.
Ah, okay. Like adding buffer zones.
Exactly. The source uses a funny analogy, like being told you can never even touch a rubber ducky, just to make absolutely sure you never squeeze it angrily at someone.
Right. An extreme preventative measure.
But the source argues this missed the point. It shifted focus from understanding God's character, the why behind the law,
to just following rules for rules' sake.
pretty much. Obedience divorced from relationship, from the heart of the law.
And the source connects this back.
It sees echoes even in Genesis 3. Satan twists God's command, and Eve adds her own bit. You shall not touch it.
Adding to the original instruction.
Right. And it contrasts this with Deuteronomy 4.2, the warning not to add and subtract from God's word. And of course, Jesus' arguments with the Pharisees in Mark 7 about their man-made traditions overshadowing God's commands.
So how did fencing apply to Yahweh's name specifically?
The commandment was, do not take Yahweh's name in vain, right? Exodus 20.7.
Okay.
So the source argues, instead of teaching people how to use the name properly, reverently, powerfully, the leaders, out of fear of misuse, built a fence so high that nobody could use it at all.
Just avoid it completely to be safe.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a quote from a Jesse Johnson article comparing it to deciding the only way to not break the Sabbath is to just never leave your house on Saturday.
The irony is pretty thick, isn't it? Trying so hard to prevent misuse that you end up losing the proper use altogether.
Exactly. A gift meant for connection becomes forbidden. That's the first factor.
Okay, what's the second factor the source identifies?
The second is described as an extreme and superstitious reverence for the name.
Superstitious. How so?
Well, this ties into the Babylonian exile, 586 BC, a huge traumatic event for Israel. The source suggests this period was key.
Because they were living among Babylonians.
Right, and in Babylonian paganism and other ancient cultures too, divine names were often seen as having intrinsic magical power, almost too potent or sacred to utter. Ineffable.
So the idea is the Israelites picked up some of that attitude.
That's the argument. The source cites a scholar, Geiger, who suggested this reluctance to say the sublime name might have started or grown stronger in Babylonia.
So Jewish practice starts looking a bit like pagan superstition.
That's the parallel the source draws. And it points to warnings in Exodus 34 against adopting the religious practices of the surrounding nations.
It contrasts Yahweh's desire for, relational reverence.
With what it calls a dead religion of external rules, driven more by fear or superstition than genuine relationship and understanding.
A shift from knowing God intimately to just fearing the power associated with his name.
Something like that, yeah. Which leads straight into the third factor.
Okay, what's number 3?
The substitution of Yahweh's personal name with just a title.
Replacing Yahweh with what?
With Adonai, which means Lord.
Okay. How did that work?
Well, the challenge, as the source sees it for Satan's alleged plan, was that Yahweh's name was everywhere in the written scriptures. Think Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh is one. You're commanded to talk about these things constantly.
Right, it's written down, hard to erase completely.
So the tactic became substitution during reading. When you came across the written YHVH, you wouldn't say Yah, you'd say Adonai instead.
As a way to avoid taking the name in vain.
That was the rationale, yeah. Rooted in that fear of judgment, of accidentally misusing the sacred name.
But the source sees this as flawed logic.
Deeply flawed. It uses an analogy. It's like having a treasure house full of gold, the written name in Scripture, but you tell everyone never to go inside or touch the gold. The treasure is still there, technically, but it's not being used, not circulating.
So the richness of the personal name gets lost, replaced by a more generic title, Lord.
Precisely. The Shema example is perfect. Deuteronomy 6.4 says, Yahweh Elohinu, Yahweh Echad, but it's almost always recited now as Adonai Elohinu, Adonai Echad.
The substitution became the norm.
It did. Even if the intention was reverence, the outcome, according to the source, was a loss of intimacy and specificity.
So these 3 things together, the fencing, the superstitious reverence, and the substitution with Adonai.
That's how the source argues the heist happened. how the personal name was effectively stolen from the people's relationship with God.
And the source connects this directly to bad times for Israel.
Oh, yeah. It links this period, when the name was fading, directly to the disasters. The Babylonian conquest, Jerusalem and the temple, destroyed in 586 BC, the exile, the struggles, even after they returned.
It wasn't just a theological detail then, it was tied to their national well-being.
The source presents it as a symptom of a much deeper disconnect, a turning away from the relationship God desired.
And then there was the silence.
Right. A really striking point. After the prophet Malachi, around 400 BC, prophetic communication from God seems to just stop for centuries.
The source quotes Malachi 4 about Elijah coming before the great and awesome day of Yahweh, and then nothing for 400 years.
Yeah, it portrays this silence as, well, horrifying, a consequence of that broken connection, symbolized by the loss of the name.
But it's careful to say the disuse of the name wasn't like bad magic, right? It wasn't the lack of the word itself causing problems.
Well, no, exactly. It was a symptom of abandoning the relationship, of replacing intimacy with fearful rule-following or external substitutes. The name represented that personal relationship.
Okay. Does the source bring in any other historical voices on this?
It does, interestingly. It quotes Casiodoro de Reina, a Spanish Bible translator from 1569.
What did he say?
In his preface, de Reina basically argued that later rabbis had misunderstood the law regarding the name. He insisted the law intended the name to be used. Yeah. He pointed out that key figures throughout the Old Testament patriarchs, prophets, kings, used the name Yahweh freely. He said it was sweet in the mouths of all the people.
So he saw the later prohibition as a mistake.
A big one. And crucially, de Reina apparently agreed with the core idea we've been discussing, that the devil was behind burying God's name, using reverence as a cover.
Wow. So, a 16th century translator echoing the source's main argument about a deliberate suppression.
It adds that historical perspective.
Yeah.
The source concludes this section by saying basically, Satan had won a significant victory at this point by getting the name sidelined.
And it hints there was more to come.
Just briefly, it suggests the next step in the strategy was trying to get the name removed, even from the written word, to hide it from the rest of the world too. But that's maybe a story for another time.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together.
Sure. We've looked at this idea of the Yahweh Heist, this gradual, almost imperceptible fading of God's personal name from use in ancient Israel.
Driven, according to the source, by that combination of misguided fencing, superstitious reverence, and substituting the name with the title Adonai.
Right. And all framed within this larger narrative of conflict involving Satan, sin, and society, working against God's purposes.
For me, the really striking part is how practices that might have started with, good intentions, wanting to show respect, wanting to avoid sin, could lead to such a massive loss.
Yeah, the law of unintended consequences, maybe on a grand scale, that desire for reverence leading to the silencing of the very name that defined the relationship.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Maybe a question for you listening is, where else in life do we see this? Where might well-meaning rules or protective measures actually end up obscuring or diminishing something really valuable?
That's a great question. It pushes us to think about the why behind our practices, not just the practices themselves.
And maybe also just reflect on names and titles generally, how we use them, the power they hold, the connection or distance they create.
Definitely worth considering. And maybe one last thought to leave you with, drawing from this whole discussion. If a name once carried that much significance, representing such a deep personal connection, what might be recovered, or at least better understood, by exploring that significance today? Not necessarily advocating usage, but understanding the depth that was seemingly lost.
Something to chew on for sure.